Vayichan sham Yisrael eged ha'ar kulanu ke'echad.
Hey everybody, this is Rabbi David Fohrman. I want to welcome you to this virtual event and say hello to all of you folks out there in TV land, as they used to say when I was a kid. I hope you're doing well in whatever state you find yourselves at home, in quarantine, or out and about. I wanted to talk with you about some hidden dimensions of this time of year that we find ourselves in particular, Sefirat HaOmer. And I want to begin by calling your attention to a kind of strange anomaly in how Sefirat HaOmer itself is described. Sefirat shows up in Vayikra 23 as part of Parshas Moedim, and inasmuch as it is part of Parshas Moedim, it kind of seems singularly out of place, because let's face it, the Omer isn't really a Moed, right? The rest of Parshas Moedim is all about these holidays. You've got Pesach, you've got Shavuos, you've got Rosh Hashanah, you've got Yom Kippur, you've got Sukkot, and then you have this digression. The Omer, and it just keeps on going on, and you hear a little bit about Leket, Shikha, and Peah, and just this very long explanation of Sefirat HaOmer. And the question is, what is it even doing, interrupting the Parshas Moedim? It seems like it should just be somewhere else in Sefer Vayikra, this strange korban out of barley that's matir chadash, that allows us to eat from the new grain, the crops of the year. What's its meaning, and what is it doing in the Parshas Moedim? And I think a clue to its meaning actually comes from the fact that it does exist in the Parsha of the Moedim. And I want to suggest a kind of what I think is an interesting theory to you. It's kind of based upon the following. What if the Omer, this 49-day period in between Yetzias Mitzrayim and Shavuos, is in some way a moed of sorts on its own? A 49-day moed, as strange as it might sound. What is a moed after all? It's a holiday. But of course, Jewish holidays, the moedim, have two dimensions to them. They have agricultural dimensions, such as Shavuos, the Chag HaKatzir, but they also have historical events that they commemorate. In the case of Shavuos, traditionally, the giving of the Torah at Sinai. In the case of Pesach, the Exodus from Egypt. So the question is, could it be that the Korban HaOmer, this agricultural korban, which serves an agricultural function, is matir chadash for us, could it be that that korban too, that process of sphera of counting from that moment that we offer that korban till Shavuos, could it be that that too has historical resonance and not just agricultural resonance? Could it be that it recalls a historical event? Well, what historical event? Well, think about the holiday that precedes it and the holiday that follows it. The holiday that precedes it is, of course, Pesach. The holiday that follows it is Shavuos. So Pesach commemorates leaving Egypt. Shavuos commemorates coming to Sinai. Could it be that the Omer, which is right between these two, commemorates something that's between leaving Egypt and coming to Sinai? But now the question is, well, what might it commemorate? What happened between leaving Egypt and coming to Sinai? What happened that could possibly have anything to do with an Omer? And I'm glad you asked that question. What happened that could actually have anything to do with an Omer? But think about the word Omer. An Omer is a measure of how much a person can eat. The Torah defines it in Vayikra 23 as an asirita ephah, a tenth of an ephah. But if you think about an Omer, the measurement of the Omer is a very unusual word. It doesn't appear much in the Torah. And if you actually ask yourself, well, where else does it appear in Chamisha Chomshei Torah, you'll find that it appears in only one other place. When's the only other time you have an Omer mentioned? And strangely enough, the only other time you have an Omer mentioned, or interestingly enough, the only other time you have an Omer mentioned is concerning an event that took place between the Exodus from Egypt on the one hand and the coming to Sinai on the other hand, namely the giving of the man in Parshas Beshalach, the raining down of that manna from heaven. Yep, the manna came down, and when it came down, you were allowed to partake and take a serving for yourself. You couldn't take more, you couldn't take less. It was an Omer lagul golet, an Omer for each person, an Omer per head. That's what you could take. And it's the only other time in Chamishei Chomshei Torah that Omer ever appears, I believe. You can prove me wrong, but I think that's true, with the exception of Vayikra 23. Could it be that Vayikra 23, that the Karban HaOmer is a commemoration of sorts of the giving of the manna, a way that we remember the giving of the manna? Some other suggestive aspects of the Karban HaOmer is actually when the Karban HaOmer is brought. Remember that phrase, when do you bring the Karban HaOmer? So it's actually on the day after the first day of Pesach. But strangely, the Torah insists on calling it something else that day. There's the famous debate between the Tzdukim and the Prushim over what the Torah means when it says that you bring the Omer mimachrat HaShabbat, on the day after Shabbat, the day after what? Well, the Tzdukim would have us believe that it's Sunday, the day after Shabbat, but the Prushim, who are our ancestors, say that the day after Shabbat actually means the day after the first day of Pesach, which is strange, right? Because you think, I know how to say the first day of Pesach, just say the first day of Pesach. Why say Shabbat? But for some reason, the Torah insists on calling Pesach a Shabbat. Okay, strange, but that's what the Prussian believe. But if you actually think about, okay, Shabbat, why actually would the Torah make such a big deal of calling Pesach Shabbat with reference to this? If we're talking about Omer, and if Omer actually has to do with the giving of the man, does the man have anything to do with the Sabbath? And of course, the answer is yes. As a matter of fact, the way we got our first Sabbath was with the story of the man, right? That's when Sabbath is revealed to us as people. So this notion of, it's not just the Omer, it's the notion of the Sabbath, Mimacharat Shabbat, even the idea of Mimacharat, right? The next day, how is the Sabbath revealed in the story of the man? It's when Moshe says that tomorrow, the next day, will be Sabbath. This notion of tomorrow and of Sabbath, it all seems like it harks back to the man. But the other question is, well, let's say it does. Let's say it harks back to the man. So let's just understand. So what are we doing? We're bringing this korban, which is a way of remembering the man, but the korban actually has a function, right? Halachically, it has a function. And the function of the korban is that it allows us to eat from chadash. It allows us to eat from the new crop of grain. What that suggests, I think, is a fascinating thing, which is that you can't actually go into the land and eat from a new crop of grain until you do something interesting, until you remember the man. Why would you have to remember the man? You have to remember that God fed us in the desert, right, before you eat from the new grain. How is it that we understand that, right? What does one have to do with the other? And I think that actually comes into sharper focus when we notice one other text that the story of Sefirat HaOmer reminds us of. The story of the man is a text that it reminds us of in the past, but it turns out that there's also a text that it foreshadows in the future. Yep, Vayikra 23, the story of Sefirat HaOmer, foreshadows another text which hasn't yet come to pass when Vayikra 23 is written. And that text is Yoshua chapter 5. I want to take you into Yoshua chapter 5, show you what's happening there. It's the moment after the splitting of the Yarden. People are coming into the land. And what's interesting is if you think about when we got the man also happened right after the splitting of a great body of water. It's the splitting of the sea. And then just shortly thereafter, in the same parsha, in Parshas Beshalach, we hear about the onset of the man. Turns out that after the splitting of the Yarden, a parallel kind of event in coming into the land, right? The moment we leave Egypt, we get the splitting of one great body of water. When we come into the land, we get the splitting of this other body of water, the Yarden. And then we get Yoshua 5. Right before the conquest of Jericho, the people circumcise themselves. And then something interesting happens. Let me share my screen with you and see if I can show it with you. Let me share my screen with you and see if I can show you what I'm talking about. So, So here you've got this kind of color-coded text. Take a look at this over here. I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see it better. And what I've really actually done here is I've put actually three texts together. The story of Yeshua over here in chapter 5, and the Omer over to the left, and the story of the beginning of the man over here. But what happens in Yeshua chapter 5? It's actually the story of the cessation of the man. So if the man begins in the story of Parshas Beshalach, it ends in Sefer Yeshua, right after the 40 years of wandering in the desert is finally up. So let's read. Vayhi kasher tamu kol hagoy lehimo, vayeshvu tachtam b'machana ad chayatam. After the people did Milah, right? Vayomer Hashem al Yoshua. God says to Yoshua, Hayom galoti et cherpat Mitzrayim ma'alechem. Today I have uncovered, right? I've done away with the shame of Egypt from you. And Vayikra Shema Makamahu Gilgal. They called the place Gilgal ad hayom hazeh, after Galoti, right? I've uncovered the shame of Mitzrayim. But we'll come back to that word Gilgal and what it might be referring to, what else it might be referring to besides Hayom Galoti et Cherpat Mitzrayim. But let's continue for the meantime with Pasuk Yud. Vayachanu b'nei Yisrael ba'Gilgal. So the people encamped in Gilgal. Vayasu et ha'Pesach ba'arbasar yom l'chodesh be'erev ba'arvot Yericho. And they actually made the Pesach offering. And when did they do that? On the 14th day, when they were supposed to. Be'erev, in the evening, ba'arvot Yericho. See, by the way, the little play on words here, which is kind of interesting. Be'erev. And that comes ba'arvot in the plains of Yericho, but it was a play off of the word ba'erev. And then vayochlu ma'avur, also a sort of anagram for the word erev and arvot. Anyway, so they offer this Pesach offering, and what do they do the very next day? The very next day, when is that? It's the day after they offer the Pesach offering. Well, what does that remind you of? Oh, well, one second. There was something about the day after Pesach that had to do with the Omer, didn't it? Well, keep on reading. Vayochlu ma'avur haaretz. They ate from the land. Mimachrat haPesach, on the day after Pesach. Wow, that word mimachrat, very unusual word, seems to really recall this word with the Omer. Usfartem lachem mimachrat haShabbat. And remember, by the way, how the Sadducees' way of understanding that seems so much more plausible than the Pharisees. I mean, I'm a card-carrying Pharisee like anybody else, but it seems strange, right? If I'm a Pharisee, so how come Machrat HaShabbat doesn't refer to the day after Shabbat? Why would we refer to Pesach as Shabbat? But if you want proof that you refer to the Pesach as Shabbat, just look at Joshua 5. Same kind of language. And Mimachrat HaPesach, the day after Pesach, what do? They eat from the land. They eat the very first chadash that ever was eaten. Chadash, isn't that fascinating? That is actually the function of the Korban HaOmer, to be matir chadash. Well, the new crop of grain, when was it the first time people ever ate a new crop of grain? The ultimate chadash was the grain that you ate when you came into Israel for the very first time you ever tasted grain coming from the land. It's the newness must have been so extraordinary. So v'yochlim avuras b'machrat haPesach matzot v'kalui be'etzem hayom hazeh. They ate matzah and toasted grain on that very day. Well, where does all this language come from? It's not just mimachrat haPesach that comes from this language of Omer, mimachrat haShabbat, miyom haviachem et Omer, right? It's also this, right? Look over here, right before this, that lechem v'kali v'karmel, right? Bread and toasted grain, lo tochlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. You cannot eat until this very day. The Torah tells us in Leviticus 23 and Vayikra 23, until this very day, ad haviachem et korban Elohechem kukat olam zarech chomesh v'techem, until you bring this korban of the Omer. This is the ban on eating chadash. You cannot eat from toasted grain ad etzem hayom hazeh. That is the language to describe the very first eating of chadash, when on the day after Pesach they ate toasted grain be'etzem hayom hazeh. And what happened the very next day? A yishbot, and there's that language. Isn't that interesting? Shabbos, right? The great Sabbath of the manna which brings us to Sabbath, which introduces us to the concept of Sabbath. Vayishbot haman milachrat. The manna itself took a Sabbath. Mi macharat, the very day after this, right? There was no more manna. Oh, fascinating. So 1 second. The Omer really does remind us of the manna. It reminds us of the onset of the manna, but it also foreshadows the cessation of the manna, the very first time we ate from new grain. And seemingly, what the meaning of the Omer is, this hidden dimension of the Omer, is that in every year after that, when you mimic what the people did when they come into the land, when you eat from this grain for the very first time, you too have to do what these people did the very first time they ate Chadash, the very first Chadash of all. You have to do what they did, which is remember the man. You see, the people who ate who ate from Chadash the very first time when they came into the land, they couldn't help but remember the man. It's what they ate for breakfast yesterday. It's what they ate the day before. It's what they'd eaten for the last 40 years. And what I would argue is that what allows them to eat from the new grain is their memory of the man, which is to say, it's not okay to eat from the new grain of the land until you remember how God fed you in the desert. Why? The answer is, when God gave you the man, and it's interesting, you see it even in the language of God giving the man. When they look at the man and they don't even know what it is, they say, Manhu, what is it? So Moshe has an answer. And the answer is, Hu halechem asher natan lecha Hashem. It's the bread that God gave you. God made bread rain from the sky. It's the bread asher natan lecha Hashem that God has given you. Well, look at how the Omer begins. The story of the Omer, or the language of the Omer, begins with Daber al b'nei Yisrael v'amart aleim ki tavo el aretz asher ani noten lachem. When you go into the land that I give you, and you eat from its grain, bring this offering. Fascinating. Omer was the lechem asher natan lecha Hashem. But it's not the case that the only time when you have lechem asher natan lecha Hashem is the bread that God gave you, is the manna. Every bread that you eat, the bread that comes from the land, is also bread that God gave you. Why? Because ki tavo el haaretz asher ani noten lachem. God hasn't just given you the manna, He's given you the land. It's God giving you bread in another way. It doesn't make a difference if it's from heaven or if it's from the ground. It's just a little different, right? When it comes from heaven, God unilaterally gives you bread out of the sky. But there's also bread that's not unilateral. There's bread that you have to work for, that you mix your labor with. But when you do it, you're actually working in partnership with God. God is giving you the land, right? And through that land, right, out of that land is coming this bread. And you can't be in a position to eat from that new crop of bread, to taste its deliciousness, without understanding the most basic case, understanding that God is the one who gives you bread. He gave you the bread even when there isn't any land, which means that it's not really the land that's providing you. It's not like you just say, well, the land's really providing me. I just don't know whether it's going to rain. That's why I look for God for it. It's no. The land is just the vehicle. The provider is God. God is providing the land, and through that, He's giving, instead of through the heavens, He's giving you the land, the bread, He's giving you the land through the earth. That's what we remember with the Omer, right? And the Omer is there to burn that into our memory, bring an Omer's worth as a way of remembering that. Remember, of course, that the manna was something that once we had it, God insisted on putting it together in the ark, right? B'nei Yisrael achlu et haman 40 shana al eretz noshavet, right? And right before that, 10 shana malo HaOmer, put it right near the Edud, right? What becomes the 10 Commandments and the Holy Ark. Hotel lifnei Hashem, and leave it before God. Forever, you have to remember that. Whenever you look at the two luchot, right? You've got to look at the manna also that was there, and to remember that God gave you this. Another way of our remembering the man, right, is every time when we bring the Karban HaOmer, we remember the way God fed us in the desert, allowing us to bring that kind of recognition to what otherwise would just seem like, well, I was a good farmer and things just worked out and the land just provided for me. Now, it wasn't really the land that provided for you. The land was a vehicle. God provided you through the land. The same way he makes manna for you, he made this bread for you, and he gave it to you through the land. Once you understand that by remembering both the onset of the Omer, the onset of the man, and its cessation in Yoshua, right? It is then that you can finally eat from the new crop of grain. So I wish you a very good conclusion of your Sefirat Omer as you get ready to offer your own shtei lechem, your own double portion of bread, in recognition of the double portion of bread of manna that we once got from heaven. We offer our shtei lechem in Shavuot, in the culmination of Omer, to complete the cycle and saying, God, we've come into the land. Thank you very much. Here's 2 loaves back for you.
Kulam, kulam, ke'echad.